Welcome to the Exchange Server Pro podcast. Thanks for joining us. I'm your host, Paul Cunningham, Exchange Server MVP and writer of the ExchangeServerPro.com website. This episode of the Exchange Server Pro podcast is brought to you by Office 365 for Exchange Professionals, the most comprehensive and up-to-date guide to Microsoft's Office 365 cloud services. You can find out more at Office365forExchangePros.com. My guest for this episode is Mike Crowley. Mike is a 6-time Exchange Server MVP and works as an executive consultant for Baseline Technologies in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Mike, thanks for joining me on the show again. Episode out as well. That was episode 4, and you can find it at exchangeserverpro.com/podcast. But this week I wanted to talk with you about the preferred architecture for Exchange. Now, for those who may not have heard the term before, Mike, could you just explain exactly what that is?
Sure. So the preferred architecture is Microsoft's nomenclature for the way they want you to deploy Exchange on premises. It's one of the terms that has been thrown around a lot more as if it's been around forever, but it's actually a fresh term in Exchange 2013. And it's a way that Microsoft has sort of grouped a bunch of recommendations together that you can measure your configuration against.
So has this existed for earlier versions of Exchange? We've always had the concept of best practices, but have they ever been this prescriptive in how they recommend Exchange be deployed?
So the term preferred architecture debuted in 2014, I believe, to apply to Exchange 2013. But the concept of recommended best practices sort of started to tighten up a little bit in the Exchange 2010 days. So we started seeing Microsoft recommend to deploy all of your server roles onto one. And that was kind of a premonition or foresight into the future versions of Exchange that have slowly reduced the amount of roles. And there were a lot of recommendations, but the term itself, preferred architecture, which is now abbreviated PA even, that's new in Exchange 2013 and reinvigorated or reinforced in Exchange 2016.
Yeah, I think I've seen in the 2010 days and maybe earlier there was some sort of infrastructure planning guidance that was more specific it applied more to specific scenarios where they would suggest that if you're a company of this approximate size with these approximate needs, then this might be a topology you would deploy. But they were very focused on certain scenarios. It wasn't that broader prescriptive preference that the preferred architecture is sort of dictating to us. So at a high level, what does the design of the preferred architecture actually consist of?
So it's a lot simpler to explain now that there's not all these different server roles. As your listeners may know, Exchange 2016 finally reduced down to just the one server role, not counting edge transport. But we don't have the client access role anymore. And in Exchange 2013, we shed the hub transport role. So the design is much simpler than it used to be in terms of the product itself. And the preferred architecture sort of simplifies the recommendation for deploying that more simple product. And there are recommendations that encompass the way that you're supposed to connect to Exchange, so the namespace planning. There's also guidance around the data center design. So the recommendation for Exchange is to deploy it in a highly available and site-resilient manner. And to do so requires multiple data centers. So there's recommendations around how you should set those up. And then there's also server recommendations that describe what types of servers you should use and how they should be configured to optimally support the Exchange workload. And then once you sort of lay out that architecture aspect to it, there's the configuration of the Exchange product itself, namely around the database availability groups and how those are set up and different ways that they replicate and how they sit on disk and that sort of thing.
Now, namespaces, I don't know about you, but I see a lot of misunderstanding and misconfiguration with namespaces. So when we talk about namespaces, we're talking about how clients connect to Exchange.
Yeah, I think there's a joke every time a new Exchange version comes out about what is going to be the complex thing this go around. And I think in Exchange 2010, it forced all of us Exchange administrators to learn what a load balancer is and how to configure a load balancer. Exchange 2013 has gotten a little simpler, but I think for 2016 and maybe 2013 as well, some of the things that are stretching our knowledge and forcing us to do some homework is this concept of namespace planning. So some customers have a very complex namespace design where they have different DNS names representing different Exchange services and trying to understand what Outlook does when it opens and which IP addresses it connects to, what certificates are involved. That can be very complex. On the other hand, you have some customers who deploy Exchange very simply. Perhaps they don't even deploy the auto-discover record, which is part of namespace planning, and that can also cause issues. So there's definitely a balance between those two poles of complexity, and that's described in the preferred architecture. So there's two basic ways that you can think about namespaces, and Microsoft describes those as bound and unbound. So a bound namespace refers to the tying of names, so like email.contoso.com, to a specific data center or to a specific set of servers. And as I mentioned before, we're typically dealing with two data centers here if you have a site resilient deployment. So a bound namespace design would have a different name for each one of those data centers. And I think this is more common in some of the smaller sides of the organization. So perhaps if your organization maybe has another data center, but it's not really as robust as your primary data center, you sort of think of that as, yeah, we sort of use that sometimes. And in those cases, you might put more emphasis on your primary data center. So that's the bound model, is where you're picking by the DNS name which servers are responding to most of the requests. However, Microsoft is trying to reduce complexity in the Exchange design. And so what they're saying is that all traffic should just really be able to go everywhere, and everything should be balanced, and everything should be symmetrical. So the unbound namespace design means that there is a name for email.contoso.com, but that might point to either data center, and you should design it in such a way that it doesn't really matter. So the Exchange product itself has lost the need for session affinity. So that's a term in load balancing where you have to really keep track of which client access server an Outlook session is talking to. And in 2010 and earlier versions, if you didn't figure this out, you could have the server start, or have the Outlook client start talking to one server. The load balancer might flip it over and talk to another server in the middle of that stream, and then the user would get something like an authentication box pop up, or there could be other issues that prevents that connection from happening. And so in Exchange 2013, that got a lot simpler, and the servers themselves take care of that sort of stickiness. And so that helps design, or that helps you implement the design of a unbound namespace, where again, we don't really care where the traffic goes, provided you have two well-built data centers and you're sort of following the other best practice elements of designing those data centers properly. But unbound is Microsoft's recommendation if you can get away with it.
If you've got the network bandwidth, and that's not out of reach of most organizations these days. Having two well-connected data centers is pretty common. Bandwidth is getting cheaper and cheaper. And what I always find is that namespaces confuse people because Exchange doesn't really hold your hand during the setup process in getting your namespaces correctly configured. It deploys by default in what is not a correct working configuration. You have namespaces on each server and on each of the virtual directories, such as the OR ActiveSync Exchange Web Services, that have the server's fully qualified domain name in them, whereas what you want is that generic DNS name, like email.contoso.com, like you say, that you can load balance across multiple servers, and that is independent. You can tear down a server and replace it with a new one without having to change any of those client configurations. And this is, there's a mentality thing here, which is thinking of Exchange as a series of services, not as a series of servers. So you're connecting to OA. OA is a service. You're connecting to Outlook. Outlook is a service. It's not a server anymore. It could be a service running across multiple servers.
Yeah, I think this is something that if it hasn't come to a head already, it will definitely come to a head in Exchange 2016, if for no reason other than the fact that Outlook now doesn't even allow you to configure the Outlook profile to connect to Exchange. If you don't have your namespaces set up right, specifically around the auto-discover virtual directory, then your Outlook clients are not going to connect, and you can't just send a technician around to go type in emailserve1.contoso.local. The auto-discover record needs to be working, and all of the namespace pieces, including the certificates, need to be accurate. Otherwise, you're going to see it in a much bigger way than you have in the past.
Yeah, it breaks a lot harder these days, which is good in a way because it forces people to go and seek out the correct configuration. And you were talking a little bit about session affinity there and how the load balancing is simplified. And even in Microsoft's preferred architecture, they even recommend a lot of simplicity and a lot of avoiding complexity. And in their dual data center design, they even recommend DNS round robin for distributing traffic across two data centers rather than trying to do complicated GeoDNS or other solutions.
And this is tough because as a consultant, you often come in, which, in my experience as a consultant, you often come in and the conversation has already been going on about how to design Exchange for some time. And a lot of times that involves third-party vendors that sell complicated products. And so it's definitely a balance both of the people who sell complex products trying to sell the value of that in Exchange versus the preferred architecture, which is sort of describing the simplicity, and then also, of course, balancing that against whatever the customer's needs are and what their thoughts and requirements are. So, I see this a little bit more so in the server architecture than I do with the namespace design. A big piece of the preferred architecture when it comes to the server design is to use physical servers. And so this is the perfect example of a religious argument sometimes. You have a very large deployment perhaps of Hyper-V or VMware, and then you got this crazy Exchange guy coming in here and saying, oh yeah, go buy some servers and plug them in next to your beautiful VMware environment because we're going to deploy Exchange. And people look at you funny. So there's lots of times like that where you really have to talk through the preferred architecture, pick the parts that make sense to you, and try to use the preferred architecture when possible. But there are going to be some cases where you deviate for the reasons of the elephant in the room or some other reason why it's obvious to make use of investments maybe you've already made.
Yeah, I've had that conversation where someone's saying, well, we'll use our net scalers to, geographically load balance and things like that. And I say, well, you could just use 2 DNS records. It's like you say, it's awkward sometimes. But when you take a real practical look at it, if you look at the average IT team, how many people are going to know how to manage that net scaler versus how many people are going to know how to manage a couple of DNS records? And I would almost always find that there might be 1, maybe 2 NetScaler experts in the team, but 5 or 6 people who can crack open that DNS console and add or remove a record without any problems. Now, you mentioned the physical servers. These are large servers that Microsoft is recommending in their preferred architecture. They talk about 20 to 24 cores and up to 96 gigs of memory. Is that the size that customers need to look at deploying?
Well, I think kind of going back to my comment earlier, which is let's start with the preferred architecture and then bring in your environment's requirements. So if we don't have any reason not to, we should deploy the preferred architecture. But there's lots of reasons not to, depending on the situation. So, for example, if we as an organization have standardized on some hardware platform, it might not make sense to go out and buy unusual servers just for your Exchange deployment. But to your point, yes, Microsoft is recommending that the servers themselves be very cheap in one respect, in the sense that you don't have high complexity storage attached to it. But on the other hand, they recommend you have 2 physical sockets and lots of cores on each of those sockets, in some cases up to 12, 96 gigs of RAM, lots of physical hard drives. So this definitely is one of those types of projects where, or deploying Exchange is definitely one of those types of projects where you have to involve the people who are responsible for the data center as well as the workloads. And in the past, I think that was pretty normal. If you had a new deployment, you would talk about, okay, what kind of hardware do we need for this deployment? But in the world of virtual machines, it's definitely something that is less common these days, where you have to describe the physical processor layout of your hardware, as opposed to just saying how many vCPUs you need and the stuff that we're sort of getting used to with the hypervisor layer.
Yeah, I mean, everything's been moving towards converged infrastructure, virtualization, consolidating on, smaller numbers of very powerful boxes, these virtualization farms, and also converging all your storage into SAN. And then along comes Exchange, and they're saying, no, we want you to go old school. We want physical servers in racks. We want locally attached disk, not SAN. And
right.
It's almost like IT teams sort of look at this and they go, well, hang on, we're used to, we've got a lot of round holes and we're used to popping in a lot of round pegs, and along comes this square peg, and we there's obvious friction there. We don't know whether we really want to do that. But the preferred architecture keeps reinforcing the point, and I always reinforce this point with customers as well, that it's all about complexity and reducing complexity.
Right. And I think if we think about where Microsoft is coming from, why did this preferred architecture become a thing? It used to be in Exchange 2003, certainly, and even in 2007 and 10 to some degree. I think we were sort of chasing complexity, and customers would think up these crazy designs, and Microsoft would then, okay, they're big customers, let's re-engineer Exchange to accommodate these ideas. And what that created was a very difficult landscape for Microsoft to support. And to some degree, they had to, right? These are the customers, and that's how business works. Is you do what the customers would like you to do, and that's sort of true. But the customer base is much smaller now that Office 365 is as popular as it is. So what Microsoft is really doing, in my opinion, is they're trying to shed the weight of the support that they've had to put out for all these complex previously designed complex architectures. And the engineering that has to go into thinking if these things will work. So not even just supporting what customers have done, but making sure the product itself would even work in that situation. And with Exchange Online or Office 365, they really know what works in a very large environment. And I think that's why it makes sense for them to suggest physical hardware, for example, or physical servers. When you're deploying hundreds of physical servers, it definitely makes sense to think about, okay, well, let's get specific servers for the job. But on the other hand, I don't think most customers are deploying their Exchange environments in that way. And if they are, they're probably the exception that proves the rule. And I think it's also kind of funny that customers ask what is Microsoft's best practice for deploying Exchange, specifically around this topic of hardware. And even saying, well, what does Microsoft recommend is sort of too broad of a stroke. Because, of course, if you talk to the folks that design the Hyper-V product, they're going to suggest that Hyper-V would be the great workload for Exchange. And, the people who are developing Azure feel the way they feel about it. And the Exchange team has their perspective on it. But I think, as an administrator, as an engineer, and as a consultant, you kind of have to look at the big picture and think about what are customers doing already, and does it make sense to rock the boat with Exchange? And so in my experience, we don't usually do the physical servers just because it's such a change in direction from the way all the other workloads are deployed. And also I'm usually dealing with around 5,000 or so, or maybe less seats. I suppose in these very large environments, you would look differently at it.
Yeah, no, it's my experience as well, is that you can certainly go forward with something resembling the preferred architecture, but usually the first element of that is sacrificed is the physical hardware. And you sort of get this virtualized version of the preferred architecture, which from a single server, like an individual server being installed, doesn't make a gigantic difference. Exchange server is an Exchange server, whether it's virtualized or not. But when you get into the actual DAG, I would say you kind of lose a few of the things that the preferred architecture is trying to give you in your DAG design. And probably the first thing I can think of is auto reseed, because once you go virtual, that generally means shared storage. So your Exchange storage is backed by a SAN of some kind, and so you're less likely to see the physical disk failures that you would see in a physical server with just JBOD storage for Exchange. And that really gives auto reseed no opportunity to do anything for you. But there might be some other things as well. I think most customers would steer away from the native data protection part of the preferred architecture. What's been your experience there?
Yeah, so that's a good point. The Exchange native data protection is a concept more so than it's a product or a light switch of using the Exchange tools and functionality to replace the backup software that you have. Office 365, hopefully as your Office 365 listeners know, they don't have a big tape backup in the cloud or even a big disk backup in the cloud. If you think about what a backup is, it's another copy of your data. Now, it's usually another copy of your data that is on some separate product. But in the case of the Exchange native data protection, you're using features within the product to do that backup and keep it all within Exchange. So the preferred architecture recommends 4 copies at a minimum of your Exchange databases. And that is so that you can have highly available copies, perhaps in one data center, and then another highly available copy in a separate data center, with that 4th copy doing what's called a lagged or acting as a lagged copy, where the log files are replaying at a slower rate than the other 3 copies. So you're sort of using this functionality, log replay. There's another feature inside of Exchange called single item protection that protects against users inadvertently or maliciously deleting files. And so you have all these settings and guidances that sort of negate the requirement to do traditional backup. And I think that's great. It's a cool idea. But again, dealing with shops that already sort of have a way of doing things where we already have a backup product and we already are used to doing that. And we like the concept of separating the backups from the technology itself. This is another one of those areas that I usually get funny looks when I recommend that people start off with that, just because there is a little bit of a change in culture of how you do Exchange backups. And I think there's also a risk that the administrator could make a mistake that would be harder to make if they had tape backups. So me as the administrator, for example, in one fell swoop, I could go and right-click all 4 databases and just delete them all. And perhaps I'm drunk, or perhaps I'm, trying to be malicious, or I don't know why I would do that. But if I had a backup copy on a normal backup, system, then it would take many more steps for me to make that mistake or to make that malicious activity. And so I think, even though it sounds good, and I like the idea of using native data protection, a lot of customers and a lot of folks feel similar to my other example where they're not quite comfortable with that because there are still risks that might not be in the technology itself.
Yeah, there's a whole operational sort of security and maturity element to it. It's not as simple as just ticking a box to say we're using native data protection now. And I have a similar, awkward conversation with people where you're trying to leverage the benefits of Exchange by saying, well, you don't need to, for example, have mailbox quotas anymore. You can just have very large mailboxes and people can keep all their email and keep it forever. And then someone says, well, that's going to get very expensive from a storage point of view. And you say, well, that's okay because we use very cheap storage in Exchange and you're deploying a DAG. And then the backup administrator chimes in and says, well, it's going to take all weekend to back that up if you let it get too big. And then you start talking about native data protection. And I have not seen a customer in my personal experience go for it. I know they exist. I've talked to a few people while I was at conferences and things like that, but in my own customer experience, nobody has gone to it, mostly because their backup strategy is part of their retention and compliance strategy.
Speaking of the retention and compliance, the way that you accomplish that with Exchange native data protection isn't just to relegate, okay, this is our archive data, let's put this somewhere else. No, all of your databases get that much larger for however far you're going back in storage. There's not a concept of, okay, these are archive databases and these are regular databases, as there perhaps would be with third-party backup or third-party archive product. And so your storage does get really high. And going back to what you said earlier, if this is a SAN on expensive storage for reasons that are, that's already in place, it does get very expensive and it doesn't always fly.
Yeah, I feel like there's probably a whole episode that could be filled up just talking about native data protection and what it really takes to get that working in an organization. And then not just the technology side of things, but the cultural shift and, just changing your entire retention and compliance strategy into something that keeps the data in Exchange rather than relying on, what is literally these days quite common is sending tapes off to an offsite storage for 7 years.
Yeah, so I think similar to that being a whole separate discussion, a lot of the things that go into the preferred architecture really are indeed separate discussions. And so what you probably should do if you're planning your Exchange environment, and what I would recommend is the consultants do, is start out by describing, and if you're not familiar with it, start out by reading what is the preferred architecture, and then apply some of your, I don't want to say sanity to imply that it's not a sane design, but it might not be sane for your environment. So just start with that and look into that, but then start, factoring in your pieces to it. So I certainly don't want this to be, me, and I'm sure you're not trying to bash the native data protection or even the preferred architecture as a whole, but let's just be clear that it's not a mandate and it's not something that your Exchange environment is wrong if you're not following. It's a good guidance and it's definitely a starting point. Just make sure you have good reasons for deviating from it.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, it's a starting point and then you find valid reasons to deviate from it in much the same way that I talk to customers and when they want to upgrade their messaging or deploy a new, if they're a brand new greenfields deployment, I say, let's start with Office 365 and then find reasons to deviate from that. if you need to consider on premises, because I think it's just a good practice these days to start with Microsoft or any vendor's best recommendations and then justify, moving away from it. So it's not mandatory. You can deviate from it. It is reasonably practical for most customers to actually deploy something resembling the preferred architecture, if not exactly to the letter. Does the preferred architecture encompass what we would consider to be all the known best practices for Exchange today?
No, I don't think it does. And I don't think it's really ever going to be able to articulate every single setting and best practice, because there's just so much going on with Exchange and so much going on with a data center, right? So part of the design of Exchange is to have two data centers. Well, there's a lot that goes into having data centers and making sure they're designed and run well. So the preferred architecture kind of gets you started. As you mentioned, we can have a whole separate conversation on the concept of native data protection. And the preferred architecture itself doesn't describe all the various different best practices that goes with that concept or any of the other concepts that it sort of just mentions starting points on.
Yeah, it's got a few of them in there. It talks about making sure that your two data centers are separate Active Directory sites, which is important for the transport resilience.
Right.
And it also talks about using the resilient file system, so REFS for your database storage, which is a new recommendation or a new best practice with 2013 and 2016. But it doesn't have some other things, like, for example, there's no mention, or at least last time I read the document, there's no mention of turning on DAC mode for the DAG.
Right. I think the way that, so all of us enter this merry-go-round at some point, and it's already been running for some time. And for me, I kind of came into this field around the Exchange 2003 product lifecycle and trying to figure out what everybody else was already doing. I tried to read all the existing documentation for Exchange and just assumed that if there was some new documentation, well, then certainly that supersedes what I know. But if there's not, then it probably is the way that it was. And so in this case, I think it's another case like that where the concepts and things of Exchange native data protection or the preferred architecture, any of the things that are discussed in 2016, well, they're probably being discussed right now because they're new or need to be reinforced. But that's not to say that there's not already best practices around some of these concepts. And even if you don't find a TechNet article that says applies to Exchange 2016, unless there's one that says it doesn't, or common sense would say it doesn't, then it probably still applies, even if it's a 2013 or maybe even 2010 article.
True, yeah. And just to, you might be able to help settle a small debate on best practices. I was recently discussing on Reddit whether running antivirus software on Exchange servers is recommended or not. And I would suggest that it actually is obviously recommended to have antivirus software on your Exchange servers, and that Microsoft publishes pretty clear guidance on how to configure that. What's your take on that as a practice?
That's interesting. I have some really strong feelings, kind of bipolar strong feelings about it. I feel strongly one way, then the other way the next. Right now, this version of Mike thinks that antivirus on Exchange servers is a good idea. Having said that, I think that, first of all, it's super important to read the documentation and to make sure you're doing the proper exclusions and things like that. But that sort of goes to my other point, which is, when you're done with all the exclusions that you need to have on the Exchange server, you have chopped out a significant swath of what the antivirus server would normally protect. And then I'm also a little bit of a glasses half empty guy on antivirus these days. File level antivirus is a great reporting tool, letting you know that you've got a virus. But the real threats these days are not a virus that turns your screen blue and moves your mouse and does all the stuff that it used to do in the 90s and the early 2000s. And antivirus software as a concept, I don't think has a real chance. There's heuristics and patterns that it can do, but as soon as I write a PowerShell script that deletes all of your Exchange databases, that basically becomes a virus, and now it's on the antivirus vendors to write a definition for it. And as you can imagine, the more knuckleheads there are out there trying to mess with your productivity or get into your systems or whatever they're doing, it's a losing battle that the antivirus vendors are writing. So the reason why I say I go back and forth on it is I sort of was one of those guys that says, it's a waste of time. It just adds complexity. You're going to mess it up and don't bother. But then I've had a couple Exchange servers either become compromised or had a virus. And I sort of wish I had some software on there, or I'm glad that I did have some software on there to deal with it, even if it was something of low complexity, or, a simple virus, or somebody browsed the internet from an Exchange server and got some malware that way. It's definitely one of those things that you don't want to be scrambling to install or to find after it's too late. So for that reason, I'm with you. I think that you should probably have antivirus. And of course, Microsoft does recommend it. Just be aware that it's not a panacea and it's not something that's going to solve you or solve your security woes. You need to make sure you're following the best practices and a lot of the bleeding edge guidance that's out there from the security industry today.
Yeah, definitely. And Microsoft has those technical articles about what to exclude from your antivirus protection, which is pretty important because otherwise you get file locks and conflicts that will literally cause Exchange to fail. Like it will fail over a database or, because a transaction log file gets locked up or something like that. So it is pretty important. And I'd say some people's experience is colored by their choice of antivirus software as well, and whether that software really behaves in an honest fashion. And one example of that is when you disable it through its little, utility console, whether it actually disables this product or not. I've seen some products from vendors that I won't name that keep running and keep doing things until you literally uninstall it from the server. So you think you're doing a good test by disabling it just to see if your performance issue or your stability issue improves, when in actual fact it's still in there interfering with your server anyway. So yeah, your mileage will vary depending on the products that you choose. All right, Mike, let's wrap it up there. Thanks again for joining me on the show. It was great to have you back again.
Yeah, good chat, Paul. Thank you.
For show notes and other details, please head over to exchangeserverpro.com/podcast. If you've got a question you'd like answered in an upcoming episode, you can send it to me from that page. This discussion about the preferred architecture was prompted by a question from a listener, so please keep them coming and give us ideas for future shows as well. If you've enjoyed the show, please tell your friends or share it on social networks. And you can also help by leaving a review in the iTunes store. Those reviews really do help in getting the podcast in front of new listeners as well. So thank you for listening to the Exchange Server Pro podcast.